The sealed letter had been in her work bag for 3 months and 4 days, and Cecily Morrow had not opened it once. She stood now in the corridor outside the Ashbourne drawing room, one hand resting against the paneled wall, listening to the voice of Lord Ranelagh carry through the closed door with the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered. He was speaking to the Dowager Countess. He was speaking about the estate. He was speaking, she suspected, about her. The work bag hung from her wrist, dark green leather worn at the strap from 3 years of daily use, the clasp secure. Inside it were the usual instruments of her position: a small memoranda book, the morning's correspondence list, a stub of pencil, a pair of spare gloves, and beneath those ordinary items, folded in half and sealed again with plain wax, in the way her father had sealed all his private files, was a letter in a dead man's hand that could end the Ashbourne earldom as currently constructed and deliver everything to Lord Ranelagh himself. She had known, when she found it in her father's study 6 weeks after his funeral, that she was holding something that could not be unfound. Her father had been a solicitor for the Ashbourne family for 22 years. He had kept his client's confidence with the meticulousness of a man who understood that discretion was the only thing standing between his modest practice and ruin. He had not told her about this letter. He had not told anyone. And now he was dead, and the letter was hers. And she had done the only thing she could think to do with a document too dangerous to produce and too important to destroy. She had kept it. She had waited. She had not yet decided what the waiting was for. Her days at Ashbourne Park had a precise and narrow shape. She woke at 7:30 in the room assigned to companions at the far end of the east wing, small and southward-facing, which she considered a considerable luxury. She attended the Dowager Countess from 9 in the morning, reading correspondence, managing the household diary, accompanying her to calls, sitting in corners at afternoon visits with her memoranda book and her careful stillness. She spent 1 hour each afternoon with Lady Louisa, which had not been asked of her. She had simply noticed the girl struggling and begun, and the Dowager had not objected, and Edmund, when he found out, had not objected either. She went to bed at 10, and sometimes lay awake. The work bag on the chair across the room. The letter inside it, a fact she had decided not to act on until she understood what action was required. The house itself was old and large, the kind of house that had accreted meaning over 200 years in the way old houses do, adding wings and portraits and obligations with equal equanimity. The park was gray in the winter months, the stone of the house gray against it. And in the corridors at night the wind had particular things it said through the window frames that it did not say anywhere else in the county. Cecily had learned the sounds of the place the way she had learned the sounds of her father's house in Bath, as a kind of grammar, a language that told her where she was and what the house required. Inside the drawing room, Lord Ranelagh said something she could not fully hear, and the Dowager Countess laughed her dry, measured laugh, and Cecily pressed herself slightly flatter against the wall, the letter a small specific weight against her ribs. The Ashbourne drawing room was the room where Cecily had first understood her place in the household with complete clarity. It had been 7 months ago, in October, 2 weeks after she arrived as the Dowager Countess's lady's companion following the death of the previous one. She had been arranging correspondence at the writing table near the window when several of the Dowager's intimate acquaintances arrived for their Thursday afternoon visit, and the Dowager had introduced her with a particular kind of precision. "That is Miss Morrow," she had said, not unkindly. "My companion. She is a girl with no one's interest at heart. That is precisely why I keep her." There had been small laughter, the appreciative kind, the kind that acknowledged a clever economy. The Dowager had meant it as a recommendation. She meant this girl had no family plotting to use her position, no suitor she is trying to entangle me in advancing, no rival household she reports to. She is neutral. She is useful precisely because she belongs nowhere and to no one. Cecily had kept her eyes on the correspondence and said nothing. She was 24 years old. Her father had been dead for 4 months. She had no one's interest at heart. She had been informed of this, and she had filed the information away along with the kind of calm that comes from understanding a thing completely, rather than fighting to misunderstand it. The letter had arrived in her possession 8 weeks after that conversation. It had been bundled with her father's client documents, which the Ashbourne family solicitor in London had forwarded to her at the Dowager's address, since she had no other. She had sorted through them in her room late at night, setting aside what was not hers, and she had found it at the bottom of the stack, addressed in the late Viscount d'Orville's hand to her father's attention, marked personal and confidential, and sealed. She did not open it that night. She read the address 4 times, and then placed it in her work-bag and lay down on her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling until morning. Edmund Ashbourne, Earl of Ashbourne, arrived at the house in the 2nd week of March, and Cecily did not meet him until the 3rd day of his stay. She had seen him in the hall, as was unavoidable in a house this size. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair silvering at the temples, and a face that had been arranged by some internal discipline into an expression of careful blankness, as though the muscles responsible for readable emotion had been quietly discharged from service. He moved through his own house with the particular restraint of a man who had inherited the weight of it late, and was still learning not to carry it visibly. He had been the 2nd son until 6 months ago. He had been, by all accounts, the easier one. His elder brother, the Viscount d'Orville, had died in August without marrying. Edmund had come home from his property in Westmoreland, overseen the funeral, inherited the title and the house, and everything the house contained, and had been at Ashbourne Park for 3 weeks before returning to London for the winter session. Now he was back, and there was something in the way he walked the corridors, pausing at doorways, standing for a moment too long at the foot of the main staircase, that made Cecily think of a man reading a letter he did not quite understand. She was coming from the schoolroom on the 3rd afternoon when she turned the upper corridor and found him standing at the window at the far end, looking out at the park. He heard her footstep and turned, and she saw the exact moment his eyes assessed and categorized her, finding a companion, nobody requiring conversation, no claim on his attention. "Miss Morrow," he said. The Dowager had introduced them at dinner. He had the name correctly. "My lord," she said, and moved to pass. "You were in the schoolroom," he said. "Not a question." "Lady Louisa had a letter to complete. She struggles with correspondence." "She does not struggle," Cecily said, more directly than she had intended. "She has not yet been taught that what she writes reflects intelligence as well as form. Once she understands that, she will not struggle at all." There was a pause. He looked at her with the first thing that was not blankness, something attentive and slightly unsettled, as though he had not expected the sentence to be that long. "See that she has what she needs for it," he said. His voice was level, carrying the flat authority of a man who directed by habit rather than by consideration. It was the voice of someone telling a servant to act. She inclined her head and went down the corridor. She did not hear him move for several seconds after she had turned the corner. Lord Ranelagh arrived 3 days later under the pretext of a long-standing hunting invitation. He was 41 years old, lean and well-dressed, with the look of a man who had been in excellent circumstances for a long time and had organized his entire personality around the expectation of more. He was, as the Dowager explained to Cecily, while Cecily arranged flowers in the morning room, a cousin of the family from the collateral branch, a perfectly delightful man, a dear friend of the late Viscount, and therefore someone whose comfort at Ashbourne Park was Cecily's particular responsibility to attend. The dowager said all of this in the way she said most things to Cecily, with the mild tone of a woman informing furniture of its rearrangement. Cecily received it without visible response and went on with the flowers. On the second evening of Lord Ranelag's visit, at dinner, he made a remark she catalogued carefully. He was discussing the late Viscount with Mrs. Philippa Carew, a family friend of long standing, and he said, in the way men at dinner tables say things they intend to be heard. Poor Dorville. He was a man burdened by conscience to an excessive degree. I always thought it would do for him in the end. He looked up and met Cecily's eyes across the table with the incidental assessment of a man who does not expect any significant inner life in the direction he is looking. He moved on. She kept her expression still. The letter shifted with the movement of her hand as she reached for her wineglass. It was on a Tuesday afternoon that Edmund came unexpectedly to the library and found Cecily there. She had the dowager's permission to use the library, which was itself a kind of information about her position. She was trusted enough to be given access to the family's books, but not enough to be told which ones to read, and the permission had the quality of an allowance given to a useful dog. She had been there for 40 minutes, sitting in the chair nearest the window, with a volume of natural history open in her lap. When the door opened, and Edmund entered, and stopped. They looked at each other. He was carrying a small bundle of papers. "I did not know you were here," he said. He was not displeased, precisely. He was recalculating something. "I can leave," she said. "No." He crossed to the desk at the far end of the room and set the papers down, and then did not immediately look at them. He stood for a moment with his back to her, the afternoon light coming in from the tall windows in a way that caught the gray at his temples and made him look older than 35, or perhaps just tired in a specific way that had settled permanently. "Miss Morrow," he said, not turning. "Did your father ever speak to you about the Ashbourne estate accounts?" She was very still. "He maintained professional discretion. He did not speak to me of client matters." Edmund turned then. His expression was contained, but his eyes were doing the thing she had noticed when something mattered to him, becoming very precise, very specific in their attention. "I know that. I am asking whether, in any other capacity, a chance remark or a passing concern, he ever said anything to you about the estate's history." "He spoke of the family with respect," she said carefully, "and with affection." A pause. He looked away, toward the window. "He was a good man. I was sorry not to be here for the funeral." He said it simply, without ornament, the way he said everything. He served the family honestly for a long time. "He believed in the house," Cecily said, and the word she chose was deliberate, and she watched it land. Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, "My brother said, 'Forgive me' 3 times before he died. That was all he managed. I've been trying for 6 months to understand what he needed forgiven." He was not speaking to her, precisely. He was speaking into the space between them, which was the space where things could be said that could not be taken back. I do not know if he was speaking to me or to God or to someone else entirely. I do not know if he wanted absolution or just a witness. Cecily set the book in her lap very carefully on the table beside her. "I believe he was afraid," she said. "That is my impression of him. Not a cruel man, not a wicked one. A frightened one." Edmund looked at her then, fully and without the blankness. "Of what?" She met his gaze. "Of the weight of what he knew," she said, which was true in every direction it could be true. I think he wanted very much to put it down. He held her gaze for a moment that was not comfortable and not comfortable to look away from. Then he said, with the contained authority of a man trying to close a thing he has opened further than he intended. Thank you, Miss Morrow. And he picked up his papers and left the room. She sat alone in the library for a long time after the door closed, the letter in her work bag pressing its small, familiar weight against her ribs, and thought about frightened men and the things they do with what they cannot put down. If any of the guests at Ashbourne Park had been asked to name the most invisible member of the household, they would have named her without hesitation, and then forgotten they had done so. She moved through the rooms with the practiced transparency of a woman who had learned that the easiest way to hear everything was to be assumed to hear nothing. She carried messages, arranged flowers, attended the dowager at dinner, sat in the corner at musical evenings, and was told by Mrs. Philippa Carew, in the pleasant, aimless way of a woman who was not being unkind, but was not paying attention either. The dowager said she is a girl with no one's interest at heart, which is why they trust her with everything and nothing at once. Mrs. Carew laughed, not maliciously. Cecily smiled and went on pouring the tea. She noticed, during those days, things she was not meant to notice. She noticed that Lord Ranelagh spent a great deal of time in quiet conversation with the dowager about the late Viscount's papers, which had not yet been fully sorted. She noticed that Edmund was conducting his own quiet search through his brother's correspondence, night by night in the study, emerging in the mornings with a particular focused frustration that sat around his eyes. She noticed that the two men were courteous to each other in the way that men are courteous when they want the same thing and know it. She noticed, too, that Edmund had begun to notice her. It was small, nothing declared, nothing that could be named at a dinner table. It was the way he looked up when she entered a room, a fraction of a second before anyone else registered the movement. It was the way he said, "Miss Morrow," when he passed her in the hall. Not in obligation, but in something that was more deliberate. As if her name in his mouth was a location he was returning to, rather than a habit. It was the evening he found her sitting with Louisa in the yellow sitting room, Louisa leaning against her shoulder, half asleep over a novel, and he stood in the doorway and looked at the two of them for a moment before saying only, "Do not let her stay up past 10, and left." And Louisa said drowsily, "He never worries about me." And Cecily said nothing, because she was quite certain he did. There was one evening, midweek, when she was returning a stack of letters to the writing table after the dowager had retired, and Edmund came into the drawing room without realizing she was there. He stopped just inside the door. She was at the writing table with her back to him, and she heard the pause. The way a room adjusts when a person in it realizes they are not alone. And she did not immediately turn. She set the last letter down and straightened the stack with a small, deliberate precision. And he said, "Miss Morrow," quietly. And she said, "My lord." And when she turned, he was looking at her with an expression she had no name for, something between recognition and a question he had not yet formed. He said, "Good evening," and left. She stood at the writing table for a long moment after the door closed, aware of her own heartbeat in a way that was not at all convenient and entirely beside the point, and went upstairs. She was also quite certain, in the way she had learned to be certain about things she could not act on, that none of it could matter until she decided what to do about the letter. She had not decided yet when Lord Ranelagh found her. It was the Tuesday before the full gathering of house guests was to depart, 7:30 in the evening, and she was crossing the main hall toward the back passage on her way to the dowager's rooms with a revised dinner seating chart. Lord Ranelagh was coming down the main staircase, and he stopped at the bottom and looked at her with the particular quality of attention she had been avoiding for days, the particular attention of a man who has stopped performing disinterest. "Miss Morrow," he said, "I wonder if I might have a word." She stopped. She had no reasonable alternative. He spoke quietly, with complete control, in the way of a man who had rehearsed this. He said he believed she had in her possession a letter from his late cousin, the Viscount d'Orville, addressed to her father. He said this letter had been forwarded to her following her father's death. He said he was quite certain she understood its importance to the current state of affairs, and he believed a woman of her intelligence and practical situation would understand that there was an offer worth considering. He named a sum. It was not insultingly small. It was, in fact, considerably more money than she would see in 4 years of her current employment. He said it would be enough to establish herself independently, to remove herself from a household that would certainly not keep her once the present complications resolved themselves. She said nothing. He then said, with the same quiet, pleasant control, that if she preferred not to accept the arrangement, he would feel obliged to inform the Dowager Countess that her companion had been concealing legal documents affecting the Ashbourne estate for 3 months, and that the resulting dismissal would make independent establishment considerably more difficult to achieve without the sum he was offering. She looked at him for a moment. "I understand," she said. He nodded, satisfied. "I will require the letter tonight," he said, "before dinner." She walked past him, down the back passage to the dowager's rooms, delivered the seating chart, and returned to her own room. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, work-bag in her lap, and she unfastened the clasp and took out the letter and broke the plain wax seal for the first time. The wax came away with a small, clean snap that seemed very loud in the quiet of the room. Her hands were steady, which she noticed the way one notices a surprising thing. The evening light came in at a low angle through the southward-facing window, falling across the counterpane and across her skirts, and across the folded paper she had carried for 3 months and 4 days without opening, and she thought, briefly and with a clarity that felt like the aftermath of long confusion, that she had been waiting not because she did not know what the letter contained, but because she had needed first to know the man who would receive it. She needed to know whether Edmund Ashbourne was a man who could carry a difficult truth without being flattened by it. She thought she knew the answer now. She unfolded the letter. Her father's handwriting was not in it. It was, as she had known it would be, a single page in the hand of the late Viscount d'Orville, dated the 17th of October, 2 years before his death. It was not a long letter. Her father had been a solicitor who advised his clients to be plain, and the Viscount had followed the advice even in private confession. He wrote that he had found, among the late Earl's papers, evidence that the deed to Ashbourne Park itself, the primary property under the entail, had been secured through a document bearing a forged signature executed in the winter of 1802 under the direction of his father, the previous Earl, in order to press out a competing claim from the collateral line. The forgery was competently done. The competing claim had been from the branch that had since descended to Lord Ranelagh. The Viscount wrote that he did not know what ought to be done with this knowledge. He wrote that it did not implicate his brother, who had been 9 years old in 1802, and knew nothing of it. He wrote that he was frightened, and he asked for guidance, and he asked for the letter to be kept in strict confidence until he had gathered the courage to act on the guidance he received. He had not gathered the courage. He had died, instead, 8 months later, of a fever. Her father had kept the letter, and now she was holding it, and she understood at last what her father had understood. This was not information that could be given to Ranelagh, who would use it not for justice, but for advancement, and not to the Dowager, who would destroy it to protect the house. and not to Edmund without first understanding whether Edmund would be destroyed by it or would be the kind of man who could survive it. She had been keeping this letter waiting to understand what Edmund was. She thought, now, that she understood. She folded the letter and put it back in the work bag and went downstairs to dress for dinner. The drawing room before dinner that night held 12 people. The Dowager Countess stood near the fire in dark gray silk, attended by Mrs. Philippa Carew and 2 other guests of long standing. Lord Ranelagh was at the far end of the room in conversation with a younger gentleman, his back to the door, though she was certain his attention was at the door. Edmund stood at the window in his dark coat, a glass of wine in his hand, speaking in low tones with Mr. Alderton, the family's London solicitor, who had arrived that afternoon on estate business. Cecily entered the room in her usual capacity as the Dowager's companion, which meant she was expected to be present and invisible simultaneously. She set a small tray of correspondence on the side table as the Dowager required, and then she did not go to her usual chair in the corner. She crossed the room. She went to Lord Ranelagh. She was aware of the room registering this, in the way that rooms registered a small change in the weather before anyone could name what had shifted. Lord Ranelagh turned from his companion and met her with a look of cool expectation, and she saw the slight movement of his eyes toward the work-bag on her arm, and the slight movement of his expression toward satisfaction. She said, in the clear, even voice that she had learned from 3 years of reading correspondence aloud, "Lord Ranelagh, I believe I must decline your proposal. I do not have the letter you described." The room did not stop. The room continued. Lord Ranelagh's expression shifted by 1 precise degree, however. "Miss Morrow," he said lightly, "I think you may be confused about the situation." "I am not confused," she said. "I have no document in my possession that concerns the Ashbourne estate. You are welcome to search my rooms if you believe otherwise." It was a calculated move, and she knew it was one, because offering the search meant she did not have the letter in a form he would find it, and not having it in a form he would find it required her to do the thing she was about to do regardless of whether it went well. She turned from Lord Ranelagh and walked to Edmund. He had watched the exchange from the window. His face was contained, as it almost always was, but his eyes were doing their precise and specific thing, reading her in the way she had felt him reading her for days. She stopped beside him, close enough that this was a private conversation and not a public announcement, though the room's attention had not disengaged. She took the letter from her work bag and held it, folded and sealed with its broken wax, between both hands. "My lord," she said quietly, "this letter was found among my father's files. It was written to him by your brother. I have not opened it in 3 months. I opened it tonight, and I have read it, and I believe it should belong to you." She placed it in his hand. There was a silence, not a long one, but one with a particular quality of held breath. Lord Ranelagh said, from across the room, in a voice calibrated to carry, "Your mother's little companion? She has no one's interest at heart. She is nobody's ally." He said it with the control of a man trying to reassert the ground beneath him. "She is playing a private game, Ashbourne, one I should very much like to understand." Edmund did not look at Lord Ranelagh. He looked at the letter in his hand. He looked at the broken seal. He looked then at Cecily, with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was the expression of a man whose carefully maintained surfaces have been reached from entirely the wrong direction and therefore cannot hold. He said, still to her, still quietly, "Did my brother write this to your father directly?" "Yes," she said. "And you did not use it?" "No." He held her gaze for a moment that was not short. Then he turned. and in 3 even strides he crossed the room to where Lord Ranelagh stood, and the room arranged itself around this movement instinctively, the way rooms arrange themselves around the thing that matters. He stopped at a precise and deliberate distance from his cousin. "She is under my protection," Edmund said, "and the letter was given to me." 12 words. Level, without elevation, without heat. The words of a man placing something beyond reach that was not previously known to require placement. Lord Ranelagh's expression moved through several adjustments at speed, and what settled was the expression of a man whose script has ceased to function. He said, "Edmund," which was both an appeal and an acknowledgement. And Edmund said nothing more, because he did not need to. Mr. Alderton set down his wine-glass and said, with the quiet procedural authority of a man who understood exactly what he had just witnessed, "My lord, if there are documents affecting the estate's title, I am obliged to review them under the existing provisions of the entail." He moved to stand at Edmund's shoulder. "I believe we should speak privately before the evening continues." The Dowager Countess had not moved from her place by the fire. She was looking at Cecily with an expression that had shifted from its usual composed certainty into something more complex and less comfortable. Something that looked, if you were watching closely, like a woman realizing that she had been wrong about a specific and important thing. She said nothing. Her fan, usually held at a very particular angle, rested closed against her palm. Lord Ranelagh made his exit from the evening early, citing a headache. The remaining guests redistributed themselves around the room with the practiced tact of people who understood that the conversation they had just witnessed was not available for general discussion, and dinner was announced 20 minutes later, and the evening proceeded. Cecily sat at the far end of the table in her usual place and ate her dinner and said very little, which was also her usual practice. Louisa, who had been permitted to join for dinner as a particular dispensation, sat 3 seats down and looked at her once with the sharp, sympathetic understanding of a 15-year-old who is paying attention to everything, and then went back to her soup. After dinner, when the guests had separated to the drawing room and the library and the billiard room in the manner of houses at the end of their evenings, Cecily went to the small sitting room at the end of the east wing that was, by long custom, hers for the hour before bed. She sat down in the chair by the fireplace and set her work-bag on the floor beside it and looked at the fire and thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of relief. The knock at the door was quiet and came 15 minutes after she had sat down. Edmund did not wait for her to invite him in before he opened the door, but he did pause at the threshold in the way of a man who is conscious he is crossing one. He was holding the letter in his hand, unfolded now, and she could see from the way he held it that he had read it. He came in and closed the door and stood for a moment. Then he sat down in the chair on the other side of the fireplace without asking whether she minded, which she found she did not. He was frightened, Edmund said. He was looking at the letter in his hands, not at her. "Yes," she said. "He found this in our father's papers the year before he died." He turned the page slightly, as though checking the date again, though she was certain he had read it 3 times at minimum. "He wrote to your father for guidance, and never received an answer." "My father died in October of that year," Cecily said quietly. "He did not answer many letters at the end." Edmund was still. "I am sorry," he said, which was not the response she had expected, and which therefore landed with more weight than she was prepared for. She did not speak for a moment. The fire crackled, and somewhere in the house a door closed, and Louisa's footstep crossed the floor overhead on the way to bed. "What Ranelagh wanted," Edmund said, his voice measured, "was this." He held the letter slightly between them. If the deed to Ashbourne Park was forged under my father's direction, the property would revert to the collateral claim, which is Ranley's. He paused. He has known about the forgery for some time. He has been looking for the documentary evidence for 2 years. Your father kept it the only place Ranley would not look. He did not keep it for Ranley, Cecily said. No. He looked at her then. He kept it for me, I think. Or for whoever I turned out to be. He said this without sentiment, flatly, the way he said the things that mattered. Your father knew the family. He knew my brother. He knew that a letter of this kind required someone capable of handling it well. He looked at her with that precise and particular attention. He left it to you. She held his gaze. He left it to his files. I found it after him. Yes, Edmund said. And then you held it for 3 months and 4 days, and did not open it, and did not sell it. And tonight you gave it to me, rather than to the man who would have used it to take everything. She had no answer for that, or rather she had an answer that was too large for the space they were in, and she had been living in small spaces long enough to know when not to fill them. He said quietly, You could have left. You had sufficient leverage to leave on very comfortable terms. I know, she said. Why did you not? The fire settled. Cecily looked at it. She thought about 3 months of carrying a letter she did not open, about a corridor outside a schoolroom and a 15-year-old learning to write her own sentences, about a man standing at a library window, saying he had been trying for 6 months to understand what forgiveness meant. I had someone's interest at heart, she said. Edmund was very still for a long moment. The letter rested in his hands, and his hands rested on his knees, and the firelight moved across his face in the way that firelight moved in winter rooms in houses that were very old and had seen a great many things, and she thought that this was what her father had understood about him, even without meeting him. Edmund was a man who could carry what needed to be carried. He said, without looking away, Cecily. The first time he had used her given name. She felt it in the way the books had always told her such things felt. In the specific, unremarkable physical truth of a heartbeat finding a new tempo. My lord, she said. Edmund, he said. Please. She did not say anything. She looked at him in the firelight and let him look at her, and neither of them moved, and the space between the 2 chairs was not very large at all, and the world outside the window was very cold, and inside the room the fire burned steadily in the way of fires in houses that have learned to keep themselves against the dark. He reached across and took her hand, which was lying on the arm of her chair. He did not say anything. He held it with a deliberate certainty, the way he did everything, as though he had decided, and the decision was not uncertain, and was not for public review, and was not going to change. She turned her hand in his, and let her fingers close. That was the whole of it. In that room, on that night. The letter lay on his knee, the confession that had moved through frightened hands and careful hands and waiting hands, until it arrived here, at the fireplace in a small sitting room at the end of the east wing, and did not need to destroy anything. In the days that followed, Mr. Alderton met with Edmund and confirmed what the letter described, and confirmed also that the specific forgery predated Edmund's knowledge or involvement by 32 years, and carried no legal consequence for the present title, the competing claim having been formally and legitimately settled by additional means in the intervening decades. Lord Ranley departed Ashbourne Park on the Thursday morning without ceremony. The Dowager Countess said to Cecily, in a private moment by the window of the morning room, something she had never said to her in 7 months. I have been imprecise, I think, in my assessment of your situation. She did not elaborate. She was not a woman who elaborated on admissions. Cecily said only, "I am glad to serve the house well, Lady Ashbourne," which was true, and was also sufficient. Louisa found her in the schoolroom on Friday, and said, in the forthright way of a girl who trusts someone, "Edmund has been in considerably better temper since Tuesday. I do not know why, but I suppose you do." She looked at Cecily with bright, perceptive eyes. "He said you were to have whatever you need for my correspondence lessons." A pause. He said it twice. Spring came to Ashbourne Park with the particular thoroughness of an English spring that has been withholding itself for months. The park opened its green, and the stone of the house lost its gray severity in the new light, and the windows were unlocked for the first time since November. Cecily stood in the library on a Tuesday morning with a book in her hand and heard him come in, and did not pretend not to notice. He came and stood beside her at the shelves. He did not immediately speak. After a moment, he reached past her and took down the volume next to the one she was holding and opened it and read a page and put it back. "There is a matter I should like to discuss with you," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would very much prefer you to remain at Ashbourne Park." "I had not considered leaving," she said. "In a different capacity than at present," he said, which was as deliberate and unadorned as all the other things he said, and which was not uncertain, and which looked at her while it was said with the expression he had when what he was saying was the most important thing in the room. She looked at the book in her hands. She set it on the shelf. She turned to him. "I believe that can be arranged," she said. He almost smiled. It was a small, controlled thing, almost imperceptible, the kind of expression a careful man allows only in very small rooms with very few witnesses. She felt it settle something in her chest that had been suspended for a long time. The work bag was in her room. The letter was no longer in it. The letter was in the estate files, in Mr. Alderton's careful custody, in the place where it would neither destroy nor conceal, but simply be. She had held it long enough. Outside the library window, the park was very green, and somewhere near the kitchen garden, Louisa was laughing at something, and the house made the small sounds that old houses make when they have been let to breathe. And Cecily Morrow stood in the morning light with the Earl of Ashbourne, and felt, for the first time in a long while, that she was precisely where her father would have wanted her to be. Thank you for staying until the end. If Cecily's quiet courage moved you, leave a note in the comments. They mean more than you know.